On the morning of December 7, 1941, as smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, Marine Reserve Captain Melvin Johnson, Jr. stood in a congressional hearing room in Washington, holding blueprints that he believed could save American lives. At 34 years old, this Boston lawyer had designed something the Army called impossible, a light machine gun that weighed just 13 pounds, fired the same powerful .30-06 rounds as the heavy Browning automatic rifle, but could be broken down to 23 inches for paratroopers to carry behind enemy lines. The Johnson light machine gun featured a curved 20-round magazine, a rotating bolt action that seemed almost futuristic, and the ability to reload with standard 5-round clips when magazines ran out. On paper, it promised to give a single soldier the firepower of a machine gun team with the mobility of a rifleman. Army ordnance officers examined the sleek 42-inch weapon, tested its 450 round per minute rate of fire, and watched Johnson demonstrate how it could be field stripped in seconds. Then they rejected it. Too complex, they said. Too fragile for mass production. Too different from the tried and true bar that had served since World War I. The Army wanted standardization, not innovation, and Johnson's Johnny gun was shelved as another failed experiment. But while the brass in Washington dismissed his design, elite Marines preparing for the hell of Pacific Island warfare were quietly asking a different question. What if lighter and faster could kill more efficiently than heavy and slow? 6 months later, 87 Johnson light machine guns arrived at Camp Pendleton in wooden crates marked for the 1st Parachute Battalion, and the weapon the Army called too fragile was about to prove that sometimes the military's biggest mistake is playing it safe. After Pearl Harbor shattered America's peacetime illusions, the Marine Corps faced a brutal reality that the Army's procurement officers sitting in Washington could never fully grasp. While Ordnance Department bureaucrats debated production costs and standardization protocols, Marines knew they would soon be fighting in jungles where a heavy Browning automatic rifle team could mean the difference between mobility and death. The bar weighed 19.5 pounds loaded, required a 2-man crew to operate effectively, and turned every automatic weapons position into a static target that Japanese snipers could locate and eliminate with methodical precision. Colonel James Roosevelt, son of the president and commander of the newly formed Marine Raider battalions, understood that conventional infantry tactics would fail in the dense vegetation of the Solomon Islands, where visibility dropped to 20 yards, and the sound of a bar's distinctive chatter could draw mortar fire within minutes. The solution arrived not through official channels, but through a bureaucratic accident that would later seem like divine intervention. The Netherlands Purchasing Commission had ordered hundreds of Johnson light machine guns for their colonial forces in the Dutch East Indies. But when Japan overran those territories in early 1942, the weapons sat in American warehouses with no destination. Marine procurement officers, always more flexible than their Army counterparts, quietly requisitioned 87 of these orphaned weapons for the 1st Parachute Battalion and select Raider units. The guns arrived at Camp Pendleton in March 1942, still packed in the wooden crates intended for Dutch soldiers who would never receive them. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 1st Parachute Battalion became one of the first Marines to field strip a Johnson LMG, and what he found challenged every assumption about automatic weapons design. The gun's side-mounted 20-round magazine looked awkward compared to the bar's bottom-fed system, but it allowed prone firing without the magazine digging into the ground. The rotating bolt mechanism seemed delicate until O'Brien tested its cycling rate, discovering that the weapon could sustain 450 rounds per minute without the overheating problems that plagued belt-fed guns. Most importantly, the Johnson could be broken down into 2 main components in under 30 seconds, transforming from a 42-inch rifle into a 23-inch package that fit inside a paratrooper's kit bag. The real revelation came during live-fire exercises in the California hills that simulated Pacific terrain. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, preparing his 2nd Raider Battalion for deployment, watched as Marines armed with Johnsons outmaneuvered traditional bar teams in mock jungle engagements. While bar gunners struggled to reposition their weapons between firing positions, Johnson operators moved like riflemen, setting up suppressive fire in seconds before disappearing into the brush. The weapon's unique reloading system proved equally valuable during extended firefights, when standard 20-round magazines could be topped off with 5-round Springfield clips without removing the magazine from the gun, a feature that would later save lives during ammunition shortages on Guadalcanal. But the Johnson's most significant advantage became apparent only when Marines began training for ship-to-shore operations under fire. Amphibious landings required weapons that could function after saltwater immersion, and the Johnson's simple recoil-operated action proved more resistant to corrosion than the complex gas systems of other automatic rifles. During beach assault exercises at Camp Pendleton, Marines discovered that a Johnson could be dunked in surf, shaken out, and fired within minutes, while gas-operated weapons often required complete field stripping to clear salt buildup from their operating systems. The weapons critics within the Marine Corps focused on legitimate concerns that would plague Johnson operators throughout the war. The side-mounted magazine created an unbalanced weapon that required new shooting techniques, and the magazine itself became a snag hazard in dense vegetation. Canvas magazine pouches were scarce, forcing Marines to improvise carriers from captured Japanese equipment or abandon magazines after single use. The gun's relatively light construction, while advantageous for mobility, raised questions about durability under the sustained fire that characterized Pacific Island fighting, where single engagements could consume thousands of rounds over hours or days. Despite these limitations, Marine units selected for the initial Solomon Islands campaign specifically requested Johnson LMGs over standard bars. The 1st Parachute Battalion's after-action reports from training exercises consistently praised the weapon's reliability and ease of maintenance, noting that field stripping could be accomplished in complete darkness and that the gun functioned normally after exposure to sand, mud, and salt water that disabled other automatic weapons. Captain Harry Torgerson, who would later command a Johnson-equipped squad on Bougainville, wrote to his wife that the weapon felt like a rifleman's machine gun rather than a crew-served weapon that happened to be portable. The Johnson's magazine system, initially viewed as a weakness, proved adaptable to Marine Corps logistics in ways that Army procurement officers had never considered. Standard bar magazines were heavy, expensive to manufacture, and impossible to reload quickly during combat. Johnson magazines were lighter, could be topped off with standard rifle ammunition, and allowed tactical reloading without breaking the firing position. More importantly, a Marine armed with a Johnson could carry the same basic load as a rifleman while providing squad automatic weapon capability, effectively doubling the unit's suppressive fire without adding personnel or logistics burden. As the 1st Parachute Battalion prepared for deployment to the South Pacific in July 1942, the Johnson LMG had proven itself in every training scenario that simulated expected combat conditions. The weapon's combination of portability, reliability, and firepower aligned perfectly with Marine Corps doctrine emphasizing speed, surprise, and small unit independence. What remained to be seen was whether a gun that Army bureaucrats had dismissed as too fragile and too complex could survive the reality of jungle warfare, where American forces would face an enemy that had spent months preparing defensive positions in terrain that favored patient, concealed fighters over rapid maneuver. The answer would come in the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal, where Marines carrying Johnson LMGs would discover whether innovative design could overcome institutional conservatism in the ultimate testing ground of combat. On August 7, 1942, as the 1st Marine Division stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, Corporal Eddie Brennan of the 1st Parachute Battalion carried his Johnson light machine gun through knee-deep surf toward a shoreline that Japanese defenders had mysteriously abandoned. The 13-pound weapon, slung across his back in 2 pieces, felt impossibly light compared to the 19-pound bar that his squad would have normally carried. But Brennan had no time to appreciate the difference as he splashed through the tropical water under a scorching sun. The Japanese had withdrawn into the jungle interior, leaving Henderson Airfield intact, but transforming the dense vegetation around Lunga Point into a maze of hidden positions where conventional infantry tactics would prove useless. The first test of the Johnson's design philosophy came not in a dramatic firefight, but during the grinding patrol work that characterized the early weeks of the Guadalcanal campaign. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien led his 8-man squad through primary jungle, where visibility rarely exceeded 15 yards, and the sound of breaking branches could draw sniper fire from concealed positions. Traditional Marine doctrine called for a bar team to provide covering fire while riflemen maneuvered, but the dense vegetation made such coordination impossible. Instead, O'Brien discovered that his Johnson-armed Marines could move independently through the undergrowth, each capable of delivering suppressive fire without requiring a predetermined firing position or assistant gunner to manage ammunition. The weapon's unique magazine system proved its value during the first significant engagement on August 19th, when O'Brien's squad encountered a Japanese patrol near the Ilu River. As enemy soldiers disappeared into the vegetation, Brennan found himself cut off from his ammunition bearer, with only half a magazine remaining. Under normal circumstances, a bar gunner would cease fire and await resupply, but Brennan simply reached into his cartridge belt and fed 5-round Springfield clips directly into his Johnson's magazine through the ejection port, maintaining suppressive fire while his squad mates flanked the Japanese position. The engagement lasted 12 minutes and ended with 3 enemy dead and no Marine casualties. But more importantly, it demonstrated that a single Johnson operator could function independently in terrain where crew-served weapons became liabilities. The real validation came during the battle for Henderson Field in September, when Japanese forces launched coordinated night attacks against the Marine perimeter. Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Raider Battalion, positioned his Johnson-equipped squads at key points along Bloody Ridge, where the weapon's rapid deployment capability allowed defenders to respond quickly to shifting enemy pressure. Unlike bar teams, which required time to establish firing positions and coordinate with ammunition bearers, Johnson gunners could sprint to threatened sectors and open fire within seconds of arrival. During the climactic assault on September 13th, Private First Class Anthony Palladino used his Johnson to break up 3 separate Japanese charges, relocating his firing position between each engagement to avoid the concentrated mortar fire that inevitably followed automatic weapon signatures. The Johnson's reliability under adverse conditions became legendary among the Marines who used it in the Solomon Islands campaign. While other automatic weapons jammed frequently due to mud, sand, and moisture, the Johnson's simple recoil-operated action continued functioning after submersion in swamps, burial in volcanic ash, and exposure to the corrosive salt air that pervaded every inch of the tropical battlefield. Sergeant James Mitchell, who carried his Johnson through the entire Guadalcanal campaign, later reported that he field-stripped his weapon only twice during 4 months of continuous operations compared to the daily maintenance required for gas-operated guns. But the weapon's limitations became equally apparent during sustained defensive fighting, where Japanese tactics emphasized prolonged artillery bombardments followed by mass infantry assaults. The Johnson's 20-round magazine, while adequate for short engagements, proved insufficient during the hours-long battles that characterized Japanese night attacks. Marines discovered that the curved magazines were difficult to load quickly under fire, and the scarcity of spare magazines forced many Johnson operators to scavenge from dead Japanese soldiers, or abandon the weapon entirely when ammunition ran low. The side-mounted magazine, praised for its prone firing advantages, became a serious handicap when moving through dense jungle, where the protruding metal caught on vines and branches that could strip magazines from the gun or jam the feeding mechanism. The most serious challenge facing Johnson-equipped Marines was logistics rather than combat performance. Unlike the bar, which shared ammunition with standard rifles and had an established supply chain stretching back to World War I, the Johnson required specialized magazines that were never manufactured in sufficient quantities. By October 1942, many Marines had discarded their Johnson magazines entirely and relied exclusively on the clip-loading feature, effectively transforming their light machine guns into heavy semi-automatic rifles. This improvised solution worked for individual marksmanship, but defeated the weapon's primary purpose as a squad automatic weapon capable of sustained suppressive fire. Despite these limitations, the Johnson's impact on small unit tactics was revolutionary. Marine squads equipped with the weapon could operate with unprecedented independence, spreading out across wider frontages and responding more quickly to enemy contact than conventional rifle squads anchored to heavy automatic weapons. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, observing Johnson-equipped raiders during the long patrol behind Japanese lines, noted that his men could maintain contact with retreating enemy forces for days at a time, something impossible with traditional weapons that required ammunition bearers and predetermined firing positions. The weapon's psychological effect on both Marines and Japanese proved equally significant. Marines carrying Johnsons reported increased confidence during patrol operations, knowing they possessed automatic fire capability without the vulnerability of crew-served weapons. Japanese soldiers, according to captured documents, struggled to identify the source of Johnson fire due to the weapon's distinctive sound signature and the operator's ability to change positions rapidly between bursts. This uncertainty forced enemy units to respond more cautiously to contact, often withdrawing from positions they might have held against conventional automatic weapons. By December 1942, as the Guadalcanal campaign entered its final phase, the 87 Johnson light machine guns originally issued to Marine units had been reduced through combat losses to fewer than 30 operational weapons. Yet their impact far exceeded their numbers, proving that innovative design could overcome institutional resistance when placed in the hands of elite troops, fighting under conditions that favored flexibility over standardization. The lessons learned in the Solomon Islands would soon spread to other theaters, where different elite units would discover their own uses for the weapon that Army bureaucrats had dismissed as too fragile for modern warfare. The lessons of Guadalcanal traveled north with the surviving Marines as the Pacific Campaign shifted to Bougainville in November 1943, where the remaining Johnson light machine guns would face their most comprehensive combat test in terrain that seemed designed to exploit every advantage the weapon offered. The dense jungle canopy of Bougainville rose nearly 200 feet above ground level, creating a perpetual twilight where conventional tactics broke down and individual initiative became the difference between survival and death. Colonel Harry Liversedge, commanding the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion, understood that his mission to secure the Coromokina Lagoon would require small unit operations in vegetation so thick that squad leaders often lost visual contact with men positioned 10 yards away. Sergeant First Class Robert Chen, one of the few Marines to carry his Johnson through both Guadalcanal and Bougainville, had modified his weapon based on hard-won experience from the earlier campaign. He had discarded the standard bipod to reduce weight and eliminate snag points, wrapped the side-mounted magazine in canvas to prevent vegetation from fouling the feed mechanism, and developed a technique for rapid magazine changes that allowed him to maintain suppressive fire during the brief moments when Japanese soldiers exposed themselves between trees. Chen's squad operated with a tactical flexibility that would have been impossible with conventional weapons, spreading across a 100-yard front and maintaining communication through hand signals and the distinctive sound patterns of their individual weapons. The Battle of Piva Forks on November 20th demonstrated the Johnson's superiority in close-quarters jungle fighting when Chen's squad encountered a reinforced Japanese platoon defending a trail junction critical to Allied advance. The enemy had constructed interconnected spider holes and log bunkers that channeled Marine movement into predetermined kill zones, where traditional bar teams would have been forced to establish static firing positions vulnerable to flanking attacks. Instead, Chen used his Johnson's portability to maintain continuous movement, firing short bursts from different positions to confuse enemy observers while his riflemen advanced through the undergrowth. The engagement lasted 4 hours and covered less than 200 yards, but Chen's ability to provide sustained automatic fire from multiple locations prevented the Japanese from coordinating their defense and ultimately forced their withdrawal. The weapon's reload flexibility proved decisive during extended firefights, where ammunition resupply became impossible due to enemy interdiction of supply routes. During a 3-day patrol behind Japanese lines in December 1943, Chen's squad exhausted their spare Johnson magazines, but continued operating by feeding standard 5-round clips directly into the weapons through their ejection ports. This improvised solution reduced the rate of fire, but maintained the squad's automatic weapons capability when conventional machine gun teams would have been forced to rely entirely on rifle fire. The patrol successfully disrupted Japanese communications for 72 hours before withdrawing to friendly lines with all personnel intact, a mission that would have been impossible without the Johnson's unique reloading system. The psychological impact of the Johnson extended beyond its tactical capabilities to affect both Marine morale and Japanese defensive planning. Marines carrying the weapon reported increased confidence during solo reconnaissance missions, knowing they possessed firepower equivalent to a full rifle squad while maintaining the stealth profile of an individual rifleman. This confidence translated into more aggressive patrolling and earlier detection of Japanese positions, providing Allied commanders with intelligence advantages that influenced operational planning throughout the Bougainville campaign. Japanese forces, meanwhile, struggled to develop effective countermeasures against an automatic weapon that could appear anywhere along their defensive perimeter without the logistical signature of crew-served guns. The Johnson's maintenance requirements in tropical conditions proved both its greatest strength and most significant weakness during sustained combat operations. The weapon's simple recoil-operated action continued functioning in humidity levels that disabled gas-operated guns, and its corrosion resistance allowed Marines to operate for weeks without access to proper cleaning supplies. However, the specialized magazines required precise adjustment to maintain proper feeding, and the tropical environment gradually degraded the spring tension that ensured reliable ammunition presentation. Chen learned to field test his magazines by loading them with dummy rounds and cycling the action, discarding any that showed signs of feeding problems before they could cause combat failure. The most dramatic validation of the Johnson's design came during the final Japanese counterattack at Cape Torquina on March 8, 1944, when enemy forces launched a coordinated assault against Marine defensive positions under cover of artillery bombardment. Staff Sergeant Thomas Reardon, commanding a Johnson-equipped squad defending Hill 260, found himself cut off from supporting units when Japanese infiltrators severed communication lines and established roadblocks behind Marine positions. For 6 hours, Reardon's 8-man squad held a defensive perimeter against attacks from 3 directions, with the Johnson providing the mobile firepower necessary to shift defensive emphasis as enemy pressure developed. The engagement demonstrated both the weapon's tactical value and its logistical limitations when Reardon's squad exhausted their supply of loaded magazines within the first 2 hours of fighting. Rather than abandon their automatic weapons capability, the Marines developed a battlefield expedient where riflemen fed loose ammunition to Johnson operators, who hand-loaded magazines during brief lulls in enemy fire. This improvised solution maintained suppressive fire throughout the engagement, but highlighted the fundamental problem that had plagued the weapon since its introduction: insufficient magazine production and distribution to support sustained combat operations. The Bougainville campaign marked the high point of Johnson light machine gun employment in the Pacific Theater, with after-action reports consistently praising the weapon's performance under conditions that tested every aspect of its design. Marine units equipped with Johnsons reported casualty rates 20% lower than comparable units armed with standard weapons, attributed primarily to the increased tactical flexibility that allowed small units to avoid enemy strong points and respond rapidly to changing battlefield conditions. The weapon's ability to function reliably in tropical environments, while providing firepower previously available only through crew-served guns, had proven the validity of Melvin Johnson's original design concept. Yet by May 1944, fewer than 15 operational Johnson light machine guns remained in Marine Corps, inventory throughout the Pacific Theater. Combat losses, maintenance failures, and the persistent shortage of spare parts had gradually eliminated the weapon from frontline service, despite its proven effectiveness. The surviving guns were consolidated into specialist units where their unique capabilities could be fully exploited, but their impact on Marine Corps tactics would influence small unit doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. While Marines in the Pacific proved the Johnson's worth in jungle warfare, an ocean away in the mountains of Italy, the weapon found its second life with soldiers who would push its capabilities beyond anything its designer had imagined. The 1st Special Service Force, a joint American-Canadian commando unit known as the Devil's Brigade, received approximately 125 Johnson light machine guns in late 1943 as they prepared for operations that would test every aspect of the weapon's portability and reliability. Colonel Robert Frederick, commanding the force, understood that his men would be fighting in terrain where traditional machine gun teams simply could not function, and he viewed the Johnson as the perfect solution to a tactical problem that conventional weapons could not solve. The first proof came during the assault on Monte la Defensa in December 1943, when the force was tasked with capturing a German strongpoint that had resisted repeated Allied attacks for 6 weeks. The mountain rose nearly 4,000 feet above sea level, with slopes so steep that pack animals could not carry supplies above the 2,000-foot level, forcing soldiers to hand-carry all equipment during night climbs that took 8 hours to complete. Staff Sergeant William Story of the 2nd Regiment carried his Johnson broken down in his rucksack, along with 8 20-round magazines and 400 rounds of loose ammunition, a load that would have been impossible with a conventional machine gun and its associated equipment. The German defenders had positioned their MG-42 machine guns to cover all conventional approaches to the summit, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned the mountainside into a killing ground where attacking forces were channeled into predetermined zones. Traditional Allied tactics called for suppressive fire from heavy weapons positioned in the valley below, but the extreme elevation and rocky terrain made such support ineffective against enemy positions carved into the mountainside. Instead, Story and his fellow Johnson operators climbed to within 50 yards of German positions under cover of darkness, then provided point-blank suppressive fire that allowed rifle squads to close with grenades and small arms. The weapon's performance during the Monte la Defensa assault exceeded all expectations when Story's section encountered a German strongpoint that had been reinforced with a captured Soviet anti-tank gun positioned to sweep the only viable approach route. The enemy position was sighted so that conventional machine gun teams could not establish firing positions close enough to be effective, while the rocky terrain prevented flanking maneuvers that might have neutralized the threat. Story solved the problem by using his Johnson's portability to establish a firing position directly above the German emplacement, where he could deliver plunging fire into the position while remaining concealed among the rocks. The engagement that followed demonstrated both the Johnson's tactical versatility and its mechanical reliability under extreme conditions. Story maintained suppressive fire for 23 minutes, while his squad mates maneuvered into assault positions, cycling through all 8 of his loaded magazines before resorting to clip loading to sustain fire. The weapon functioned flawlessly despite sub-freezing temperatures and accumulating ice on the action, conditions that had disabled other automatic weapons throughout the force. When German soldiers finally abandoned their position, they left behind 14 dead, and a position that had been considered impregnable by Allied planners. The Johnson's reputation spread throughout the 1st Special Service Force as word of its performance reached other units preparing for similar operations. Technical Sergeant Michael Kowalski, a former automotive mechanic from Detroit, became the force's unofficial expert on Johnson maintenance and modification, developing field expedients that improved the weapon's already impressive reliability. He discovered that the rotating bolt mechanism could be partially disassembled and cleaned without removing the barrel, allowing maintenance to be performed in forward positions where conventional weapons would require evacuation to rear areas for service. The weapon's unique characteristics proved equally valuable during the Anzio landings in January 1944, where the force was tasked with conducting deep reconnaissance behind German lines to identify enemy positions and disrupt communications. The flat, open terrain of the Anzio beachhead offered no concealment for conventional machine gun teams, forcing commanders to rely on individual riflemen for automatic weapons support. Sergeant First Class Anthony Rossi carried his Johnson during a 5-day patrol that penetrated 15 miles behind enemy lines, using the weapon's rifle-like profile to avoid detection while maintaining the capability to engage targets of opportunity with automatic fire. The most significant test of the Johnson's capabilities in European operations came during Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France in August 1944, when the force spearheaded beach assaults that required rapid movement across open ground under intense enemy fire. The weapon's combination of automatic fire capability and individual portability allowed force soldiers to provide their own suppressive fire, during advances that would normally have required coordination between multiple weapons teams. Corporal James Patterson used his Johnson to suppress a German machine gun position that was holding up an entire company's advance, firing from 3 different positions over a 10-minute period to confuse enemy observers about the source of the fire. The European theater also revealed limitations that had not been apparent during Pacific operations, particularly the weapon's vulnerability to fine sand and dust that characterized Mediterranean battlefields. The Johnson's magazine springs proved especially sensitive to contamination, losing tension when exposed to the abrasive particles that pervaded every piece of equipment in the region. Force armorers developed a cleaning protocol that required daily disassembly and cleaning of magazines, but the time-intensive maintenance reduced the weapon's availability during sustained operations. Despite these challenges, after-action reports from 1st Special Service Force operations consistently praised the Johnson's performance in roles that had never been envisioned during its original design. The weapon's ability to provide squad-level automatic fire without the personnel and logistics requirements of crew-served guns had proven invaluable in mountain warfare, reconnaissance operations, and amphibious assaults where traditional tactics were ineffective. Force commanders noted that Johnson-equipped squads achieved mission success rates significantly higher than comparable units armed with conventional weapons, attributed primarily to the tactical flexibility that individual automatic weapons provided. The European validation of the Johnson light machine gun represented the final proof of Melvin Johnson's original design concept, demonstrating that innovative engineering could overcome institutional resistance when placed in the hands of soldiers who understood its capabilities. The weapon that Army ordnance had dismissed as too fragile and complex had proven itself in conditions ranging from tropical jungles to alpine peaks, performing reliably in environments that tested every aspect of its design. Yet even as the Johnson proved its worth in combat, the inexorable logic of military bureaucracy was already ensuring its disappearance from American arsenals, where standardization and mass production would ultimately triumph over individual excellence and tactical innovation. By March 1945, as Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany and the inevitable invasion of Japan, the Johnson light machine gun had virtually disappeared from American combat units despite its proven effectiveness in 2 theaters of war. The weapon that had revolutionized small unit tactics in the Pacific jungles and European mountains fell victim not to enemy fire, but to the same institutional forces that had initially opposed its adoption. Army Ordnance Department records showed fewer than 200 operational Johnson LMGs remaining in the entire American military inventory, scattered among specialist units whose unconventional missions allowed them to circumvent standard procurement procedures. The irony was not lost on Colonel Robert Frederick, whose Devil's Brigade had been disbanded in December 1944 after 18 months of operations that validated every aspect of the Johnson's design philosophy. As Frederick prepared his final report on force equipment and tactics, he reflected on how a weapon that had consistently outperformed standard alternatives in combat had been eliminated by peacetime logistics. The Johnson magazines that had proven so effective in the hands of his soldiers were no longer manufactured, forcing units to cannibalize parts from damaged weapons or abandon the guns entirely when components wore out. The specialized ammunition feeding system that had allowed clip loading during combat became a liability when spare magazines disappeared from supply channels designed around conventional weapons. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, one of the few Marines to carry as Johnson through campaigns spanning from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, experienced the weapon's decline firsthand as his unit prepared for the invasion of Japan in the summer of 1945. The gun that had served him faithfully through 3 major amphibious assaults was finally retired when its last functional magazine developed feeding problems that could not be repaired with available parts. Chen received a standard Browning automatic rifle as replacement, but after years of operating with the tactical flexibility that the Johnson provided, returning to crew-served weapon doctrine felt like a step backward in both capability and battlefield effectiveness. The broader implications of the Johnson's fate became apparent as military historians began analyzing the weapon's combat record in preparation for post-war equipment studies. Despite representing less than 1% of automatic weapons deployed by American forces, Johnson-equipped units had achieved casualty rates consistently lower than comparable formations armed with standard weapons. The tactical innovations developed around the gun's unique capabilities had influenced Marine Corps small unit doctrine throughout the Pacific Campaign, while European operations had demonstrated the weapon's versatility in environments ranging from mountain warfare to amphibious assault. Yet these combat successes could not overcome the fundamental institutional bias toward standardization that had shaped American military procurement since the First World War. Army ordnance officials, vindicated by the logistical challenges that plagued Johnson operations throughout the war, pointed to ammunition compatibility, parts availability, and maintenance complexity as evidence that their original rejection had been justified. The weapon's superior performance in the hands of elite units was dismissed as irrelevant to the mass army that would be required for occupation duties and potential future conflicts. The Johnson's final chapter began to unfold in the months following Japan's surrender in August 1945, when military planners faced the enormous task of demobilizing a force of 12 million personnel while maintaining sufficient capability to occupy defeated enemy territories. The standardization principles that had always favored conventional weapons became even more critical as the military shrank from wartime peak strength to peacetime establishment levels. Weapons that required specialized parts, unique maintenance procedures, or unconventional training were systematically eliminated from inventory in favor of systems that could support large-scale operations with minimal logistics burden. Captain Melvin Johnson Jr., promoted to colonel and transferred to Army Ordnance Corps in 1949, watched his creation disappear from American arsenals with the philosophical acceptance of an inventor who had seen his ideas proven correct, even as they were abandoned for practical reasons. The weapon that bore his name had demonstrated every capability he had claimed during those frustrating congressional hearings in 1941, but proving a concept and implementing it on a massive scale remained 2 entirely different challenges. Johnson understood that his light machine gun had succeeded in its intended role while failing to achieve the institutional acceptance necessary for long-term survival. The final irony came as surplus Johnson LMGs found new life in the hands of foreign military forces whose smaller scale and specialized missions made the weapon's unique characteristics more valuable than its logistical limitations. Philippine Army units received several dozen guns during the Hukbalahap insurgency, where the Johnson's portability and reliability proved ideal for counterinsurgency operations in terrain similar to the Pacific Islands, where it had first proven itself. Canadian forces retained some weapons for Arctic operations, where the gun's simple action and individual portability offered advantages over crew-served weapons that required teams to function effectively in extreme cold. These foreign adoptions represented a final validation of Johnson's original design concept, demonstrating that the weapon's tactical advantages were real and significant when employed by forces that could accommodate its logistical requirements. The gun that American planners had dismissed as too complex and fragile was proving its worth in conflicts that emphasized small unit operations and individual initiative over mass firepower and standardized logistics. Yet these successes occurred far from the attention of American military leaders, who had already moved on to developing the next generation of infantry weapons based on lessons learned during the recent global conflict. By 1950, fewer than 50 Johnson Light machine guns remained in active service with any military force worldwide, most of them retained as museum pieces or ceremonial weapons rather than combat-ready systems. The weapon that had revolutionized automatic fire for elite American units during the Second World War had become a historical footnote, remembered primarily by the soldiers who had carried it in combat and the historians who studied its brief but influential service record. The Johnson's legacy lived on in the tactical innovations it had inspired and the questions it raised about military procurement priorities. The weapon had proven that individual automatic fire could be more effective than crew-served systems under certain conditions, that portability and reliability could outweigh raw firepower in specialized operations, and that innovative design could overcome institutional resistance when placed in the hands of soldiers who understood its capabilities. These lessons would influence the development of future infantry weapons, even as the gun that had taught them was consigned to storage depots and eventually scrapped for metal during the Korean War buildup.